Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's my privilege to have as my guest Dr. Ashley Hales. We're going to speak about her new book, A Spacious Life, Trading Hustle and Hurry for the Goodness of Limits. Ashley holds a PhD in English from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. She's a writer, speaker, and hosts the Finding Holy podcast. Ashley's married to a pastor, and she's the mother of 4 young children. Her writing has been featured in such places as Christianity Today, the Gospel Coalition, and Books and Culture. She loves speaking around the United States, and she's also the author of Finding Holy in the Suburbs. You can connect and find out more about Ashley at aahales.com or on Instagram or Twitter at aahales. I'm really excited about this conversation. We're going to do a deep dive into a spirituality that envisions life as being spacious, with the key to moving into that spaciousness, not simply doing more, but instead embracing the God-given limitations in our lives and finding, maybe surprisingly for some of us, that by embracing our limits, our life actually gets bigger. Let's jump right into the conversation. Welcome to the show, Ashley. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, can you just start by sharing some of your key moments in your own spiritual journey that led you to speak and teach and podcast and now write this new book, A Spacious Life, Trading Hustle and Hurry for the Goodness of Limits? Can you talk about how you got to this point?
Sure. Well, I started out with a PhD that took a very long time because we have 4 children and I pushed pause after each child was born. But eventually I finished that. I thought I would kind of end up in the academy. And God had other plans. I always thought I was someone who could write about writing more than write myself. But after my 4th child was born, I felt like I needed something creative. I needed something as a spiritual discipline to practice finding beauty in ordinary, mundane moments. And I needed something also that could take me beyond like simply doing the diaper changes and the laundry. So I started writing, and then it became kind of a way, as I wrote my first book, Finding Holy in the Suburbs, and this next one, A Spacious Life, a way to kind of practice what does it look like and to think more deeply about a Christian life in my ordinary life. And so it became, a way to commune with God and a way to create community. And then podcasting became sort of a thing for me. I host the Finding Holy podcast because, as you know, right, when you're writing, it can feel, like you're just behind a screen and you don't have any sort of collegiality. And so I wanted colleagues. And so I kind of created that through the podcast. And just, I love having deep conversations. And so maybe I wasn't always having those all the time with neighbors, but it was a way to begin to have these deep conversations about the things that matter. And then I always ask my guests about their laundry routines. And so a chance to actually integrate what we know with how we live. I think now I feel like the writing and the podcasting and the teaching and the speaking, it makes sense of a lot of my earlier ambition and desires to be teaching in the academy. No matter what, I've kind of found that I'm called to help people kind of develop a more robust Christian imagination. And I feel like whether I'm in the classroom teaching about literature or whether, I am teaching about our limits, that is a way to begin to have those conversations.
Yeah, and I love your writing style too on the book. You're able to weave in some pretty personal stuff that you put in the book, and then with scripture and just great stories that wraps it up. So it's really really grateful that you've embraced this calling. And so let's just jump right into it. What's the problem with hustle and hurry, Ashley? Since that's kind of the basic message these days, right?
Yes. Well, I think hustle and hurry are the virtues of kind of our Western individualistic society. And so we tend to think that through hustle, through hurry, we're going to somehow get to like a more meaningful life. I just think of a lot of neighbors I know, particularly women who are taking, they're trying to figure out how to work remotely. They're schooling their kids online during COVID-19. As things are opening up, they're taking their kids to about 800 activities or camps, this summer. And, then they're trying to fit in like a girls' night or a Bible study, and their schedules are jam-packed. They're working so hard. And so what ends up happening through hustle and hurry is that we cycle between production and then escape. Good. So we're not actually resting, right? We're working ourselves into a frenzy because that's how we think we're going to get to meaning. And we don't ever get there. We think it'll happen sometime far off in the distance, when our children leave home or something like that. And I think there is a way to actually experience spaciousness in our lives, in our ordinary lives, in our real lives, and not like push it off. But we have to actually reckon with hustle and hurry that those are not the roads that we're going to get to a more meaningful life.
Yeah, and just throw a couple words in just to get some clarity on that. I mean, like, if we were going to say, like, as Christians, if we have a sense of calling, like you had a sense of calling to write, but then then you're married, you have 4 children, you're trying to do your PhD, your husband's working, and again, we didn't even talk, but I mean, probably moving around different places just to fulfill calling. So how do you actually discern between like embracing your own calling, maybe a true godly ambition, maybe God really has put on your heart something big, and then how do you know or sense whether that's really from God or if it's just selfish or misguided ambition, if we want to grab like the language that Paul uses in like a Philippians or something?
I think that's such a great question because, ambition isn't wrong.
Right.
Having desires or plans aren't wrong. And so I think we can often think embracing our limits means like we just sit down and do nothing and expect God will like give us pixie dust on our lives and everything will become magically clear. But we are told, right, to work out our salvation. So the gospel isn't opposed to effort, but it is opposed to earning, right? Dallas Willard says. And so I think when we think about godly ambition, one thing I was thinking about is Buechner talks about the pattern of the Psalms and the pattern of the Christian life, moving from orientation to disorientation to reorientation. And so usually there's some kind of valley experience in the Psalms. And of course, we see that in the life of Christ in both his testing in the wilderness, as well as, of course, in the Garden of Gethsemane before he's crucified. And I think that our godly ambition will probably follow some of that pattern versus I think we like maybe a more, misguided ambition. We think will always go like up and to the right? That the trajectory is always improving, that you move from your cubicle to the corner office to partner of a law firm and, your children are always beautiful and perfectly behaved. But, it's those valley experiences, those disorientation, I think that helps us to reframe some of that ambition so that it's chastened a little bit. And I think too, maybe even the way in which we can hold our ambition more loosely, to be okay with giving it up, I think gives us a clue a little bit about how we are using it either for God's kingdom or for our own kingdom.
It's really helpful. And, you used just a couple of words already that you've used the word identity, I think at least once, and you've used meaning a couple different times, and we threw in ambition. So how does one find meaning and identity apart from just what you just said, the idea that we're always going to have progress? Because in a sense, your book struggles with, I mean, it's not struggles, it's actually trying to solve that dilemma, right? Where true meaning and identity come from. So how do you actually embrace, have ambition, but within an identity of being loved by God and the meaning coming from who you are in Christ over against the stuff that you do? And that's always the tension, I suppose.
It is. And, as we were talking even beforehand, thinking, this book is coming out in September, right? Everyone's got their, fall schedules, and, they're reevaluating their lives, and they got their new planners, right? And there's so much that's pushing us into like how you use your time. And so I think even if we thought of a few categories to help us understand this kind of push-pull between work and ambition and effort on the one hand, and the sense of spaciousness by embracing our limits. And it might even be like, you could take your calendar out, look at your calendar. We all have limits of our seasons, of our finances, of our bodies, our places, our whatever kind of family situation we're in. And I think even just looking at a week or a month on our calendars is one way where we can begin to at least ask ourselves some harder questions, and to bring those questions in prayer to God about how we're spending our time. That might be one kind of practical way that we can begin to ascertain, am I doing all of these activities and things because I feel like they make me more fully alive in Jesus? Or am I doing these because, I feel like everyone else is around me is doing them? I feel like my children are going to fall behind. Behind what is always a question, but if they don't do all of these sorts of things, and we begin to ask ourselves some of these questions, so that we're at least understanding why we're doing what we're doing. And then, some of the identity pieces, I believe, happen as we kind of honestly slow down, as we sleep. I talk in the book about various invitations, and I think our limits ultimately are invitations. They're invitations to be human, to know God and make him known. And we see Jesus doing this all throughout the Gospels, that his limits were actually embraced, his common human limits. And so maybe like those invitations, whether they are to rest or to delight or to practice Sabbath, to put down social media, that these are maybe our modern ways in which we're actually choosing to do something countercultural. And in those little daily practices, like putting your phone away for a 24-hour Sabbath, will actually reframe how we view the world, how we go out and work in the world, and how we go about our work.
I like those. I love those practical ideas. And again, that's one of the things I liked about your book. And so in a sense then, limits, boundaries that we have, that's actually ironically the way to have freedom, right? So,
right.
So how, if you were talking to a really busy person, whether it's a person like yourself, has a mother who's at home with kids, who's a professional, or whether it's just a dad who's super busy, like how do you, what is your technique that you use, or maybe the how does a conversation go where you help somebody to kind of realize their limits, and then like what's your first like, hey, why don't you try this? Or is it what you just said, you try to get people to pull off social media for 24 hours? How does that work for you when you're helping somebody one-on-one?
That's a great question. I think what I realized when I started writing this book is I realized I wanted to offer an argument. I wanted to kind of pull at the threads of all of these self-help books that are like, you can find your true identity inside yourself, and you can work harder and be who you want to be. And I wanted to kind of argue, that person in the corner office and just tell them how that's all wrong. But then I think I shifted in the writing of the book and realized, I think especially middle-aged women, and probably a lot of young people too, as they're coming out of college, feel this pressure to kind of curate their own lives.
Yeah.
And they feel like they have to do everything. And most of the time they're actually exhausted, and they feel full of shame, and they are lacking limits in their lives, and they don't know what to do with it. And so I think as I imagined that reader, the one who's trying to spin all the plates, and not necessarily everything's firing on all cylinders, but feeling the weight of all of those plates, I began to try to think about how can we offer our limits as invitations.
Yeah.
And I think that's a way to kind of reframe the whole conversation in ways that are really helpful to people. And so when I'm talking to someone, I actually had a conversation with a neighbor back when we lived in California, and she was I was just saying, I'm writing a book on limits. And she was saying, wait, so I don't have to, my partner's has a health diagnosis, and I'm trying to volunteer in my children's class, and I have like 3 entrepreneurial ventures, and I don't have to have everything firing on all cylinders. And I was like, no, you can be human. So I think even just telling people like, you can be human, you don't have to be superhuman, or even encouraging them. I was talking with a woman the other day who's, flying out. I think they got back from a vacation. We had one day together, and then she's flying out to go present to the CEO. And I was just saying, that is great. That's so exciting. But also, I hope you have some downtime, so even realizing there will be seasons that are full, and then realizing we're human and that we need to recover from some of those seasons too, or just putting those sorts of rhythms into practice are great kind of markers to remember our humanity.
Yeah, I like the section you had. I just remember the part of the book that you were kind of just mentioning, where you say you'll go have a super busy week, which is fine. There are seasons of busyness, but I love even my own coaching talking about seasons. Even professional athletes, they may, or even a Navy SEAL can go without sleep for days, but when they're done with the mission, they actually sleep and stuff. And so, but a lot of times we don't get that memo, and we just jam as much as we can, and then you never get a chance to do what you said, be human, and it just ends up being a grind, and you just end up burned out, or even and even like, as we're talking to a lot of Christians on this podcast. Yeah. One of the biggest dangers is if you have a religious calling, and we have a lot of pastors that listen to the show, no pastor ever has gotten in trouble for working too much. Yes. Right.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
Yet that's the exact opposite of what a real spiritual life looks like. And, and you talk a lot about sleep and Sabbath. And I think those are kind of 2 fun, sort of clear God-given markers that we see in the scriptures. And so sleep and Sabbath, how are those undervalued, and what would it look like for Christians, let alone the whole world, to kind of re-embrace, hey, let's try to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep as much as we can. And then, practice a Sabbath.
Right. I think, in our Western world, we tend to value and measure our worth by numbers, right? So how many hours you're working a week, even social media followers, how much money do you have in the bank? And because we have a number, we can be like, I'm worthy because I have this number, right, to look to. But unfortunately, right, that number, like the goalpost keeps moving back, right? Or the number keeps moving up. And so it's, our identities, as we've been talking, right, aren't something to achieve, but to receive. And good. So I think when we think of Jesus, I love, the only 2 times we hear the audible voice of God the Father, right, he's saying the same thing. And he's saying, here's my son. I love him. He's amazing. You should listen to him. And, because of that identity that Jesus has with the Father, he is able to go about his ministry, right? He doesn't have to prove anything. So he takes a nap, right, when he is out on the Sea of Galilee, and he practices Sabbath. He wakes up and goes and prays and communes with his Father before he goes about his business of preaching and healing. And I think a lot of the times, if we don't have those same rhythms in our lives, we're going to keep trying to work harder. We're going to binge watch too much Netflix and stay up too late and not respect the limits of our body. Or we're going to keep trying to always check our email. We're going to think, okay, sure, I'll do this Christian thing, right? I'll go to church, I'll go to worship. But after that, I better hustle and get things done, or even doing pleasurable things. It's like we're trying to accumulate our identities instead of first receiving it from God. And so something, as simple as I'm going to not have a blue screen, up in my face after 8 p.m. or, and then I'm going to put plug in my phone in the kitchen and not use it for alarm. So email isn't the very first thing that I check first thing in the morning when I wake up. I'm going to practice the daily office and Sabbath and be out in nature and be with my family and my community and my neighbors. I think it does really open up this sense of spaciousness that then we can continue back into our work weeks and do the things we need to do, but it isn't something that we're quite hustling for in our worth. It's so revolutionary. And I think we notice like that itchiness, when we actually are silent right before God, or, we're choosing to pause to pray, or, we think we're going to miss out if we actually have a good night's sleep. What am I going to miss, right? If I take a Sabbath and take a nap during the day.
In the word spaciousness, I should have raised this question already. I mean, that's the basically right in the beginning of the title, A Spacious Life. And I loved even how you just talking about the word, but when you say spaciousness, what is it what does that word mean to you? And I guess you sort of talked about how it's an invitation, but can you say a little bit more about that word? Because it's a great word. And I like how how you're using it already.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think there's a few kind of connection points for me. I love I think it's Psalm 18, where, it talks about, the psalmist says that you have brought me out to a spacious place, and he has rescued me because he has delighted in me. Wow. And yet we know that we go through turmoil and we go through suffering. And yet we see in the life of Christ, like that there is this spaciousness, this communion with the Father that he experiences, even at the point of death, right? And so I'm convinced, that the Christian life follows the pattern of Christ's life. And so if we are to get the life of the Spirit and the life of Christ in us, we have to follow some of those same rhythms. But what is fascinating about the limits thing is really, as I was kind of imagining this book, is in the last battle, the last of the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, there's King Tyrion and the Narnian children, right? And they're forced, they see this stable, and this stable has been this ramshackle place. It's been the site of the false god Tash. They get backed into a corner in the battle, into the stable. And there's this beautiful line Lewis has, and he says, Tyrion says, when they kind of are actually in this whole another dimension, right? They come into the stable and it expands. It's kind of like those tents, right, in Harry Potter, where when they get in, and all of a sudden, there's a whole mansion inside this very small space that looks really small and homely and tight and restrictive from the outside. And Tyrion says, oh, the inside is actually bigger, than the outside. And Lucy comments, yes, that in our world too, once the stable held the whole world. And so as I was meditating on these sorts of things, I think limits are like that too. They're like that stable that when we look at it and we're like, I don't actually want to embrace my human limits. I think that's going to feel like death and something restrictive, something ramshackle and falling apart. And I don't think I'm going to be safe there. But once we enter in, we find that the inside is actually bigger, that something expands. And so I think as I was thinking through it, the idea of spaciousness as a form of rescue that also has this paradox to it became a really important way to think about how we move forward.
I love that. I always I like to talk with folks in my coaching with about I always have them make cleanup lists, and I always because it is like the idea, because it's like, to me, the spiritual discipline, spiritual formation, that's why I really like your title, and I like the word spaciousness, that it's ironic that your life actually does get bigger, and it's not exactly easy to tangibly describe that, just like we're doing, but in the sense, it's if you trust God enough that God has your best interest at heart, right. And that you can take on the yoke, like even Jesus talks about, my yoke's easy, and you're like, what are you talking about? But I think that's what you're easy. That's kind of what you're teasing out, this whole idea that the life that God dreams for us when he created us is really big, and ironically our own effort to earn something makes it small.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So, use the word delight. You say maybe, and I was wondering, I guess it comes out of Psalm 18. I may not have picked it up in the book, but I love that. It shows up. I mean, delight's used in multiple Psalms, and like even Psalm 1, my delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his word I meditate day and night. And so you have that delight as kind of an antidote to busyness. So
Mm-hmm.
how can we help? And I guess even me, it's like, I would say if I was struggle with anything, it's like, I don't always, I'm kind of a very driven person. I have a lot of goals and everything. And I, if I was going to say what's something I don't do, I probably don't delight enough. So if like, so help me a little bit today, Ashley. So like, what are some practical ways to learn how to practice delight in our lives?
Yes, I think that's such a good question. And I felt like I used to be good at delight, and as I've aged, I feel it's harder, right? Because there's so many responsibilities, so many worries about what's going to happen or whatnot. And so I think delight, though, is a muscle like hope, and it grows the more we use it. And so one thing it would be to watch children, right? Watch small children if you have them, or if they're in your neighborhood, or you're walking through a park. I think even just paying attention to what does delight look like for children is a good practice. Or even asking yourself, so I can ask you, Brian, what did you enjoy as a child?
Yeah.
I mean, so like for me, I just quickly, like I loved playing in the pool, right? In the summers, like that felt like freedom. And so that was a practice I even did the other day, or last summer, I think it was actually, where I was choosing, like, I'm going to go play in the pool with my kids. Even though I don't want to, I'd rather read a book on the side, at the side of the pool, but choosing some of those earlier practices. So yeah, what did you have maybe in your childhood that brought delight that you could return to?
That's good. And you're actually asking me
I'm
right now, right?
asking, yeah.
No,
We're
that's
gonna flip the microphone.
No, this is good. No, this is good. So, I guess when I was very odd child, I have to say, just because when I was a little kid, I wanted to be a professor when I grew up. So like when I was a big reader, and I guess music. So I would say reading, music, learning stuff was what I really took delight in when I was a kid. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes now it's like, kind of got to do what I thought I wanted to do. And so like, what would you say to me just with from that response?
Yeah. Well, I think even some of it too is like, as I hear you talking about, playing music, and sometimes we can try to just be proficient at something. So I wonder even, is there a new instrument you can learn, or a way to play the instrument you play, or to enjoy listening to the music that you enjoy in ways that feel a little childish, and feel like you could fail and make mistakes and it could be okay. Because I think that's got to be part of it too. And not simply like, I'm going to be really great at the piano, right? It's another something to achieve. So yeah, what could be playful, that feels fun and maybe risky, but you also don't have to like share it with the world. So it's okay.
No, that's actually really helpful, because it's actually funny. I have a therapist, and she actually said exactly what you just said to me. She goes, "Why don't you play your guitar with no agenda?" And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And it's like, well, and then, but that's actually, I think, the hard thing. I think for some folks, because it's like, I don't know if you've ever met Mandy Smith. She has a book called Unfettered that just came out this year, and she talks about trying to grab this childlike faith again. So she talks about playfulness a little bit too. And I got to say, again, this doesn't need to be about me, but that's the piece that I think is hard. And haven't maybe it's just my personality, but I would say I actually struggle with that, because I don't have any problem, for example, with failing, because I've convinced myself a long time ago the only way to succeed is to learn how to fail and then get back up and keep moving forward. But the playfulness stuff would be something like, I always pray to have joy in the journey, and that's probably the playfulness is interesting. And that's what Jung did, the same thing, right? Carl Jung, he would go out and just play in the sand or something, supposedly, right? So what is it about playfulness, you think, in childlikeness that's so important for us to grab as adults?
I think it just helps reorient us to our common humanity too. I think sometimes we can take ourselves so seriously, or use our jobs or our degrees, or our travel plans as like markers of, look at me, I've created this beautiful life. And I think there's something really refreshing, right, about being around people, right, that feel free to fail and to ask good questions of people, and to feel like they are in it. I remember I met, when my kids were really little, I met a mom, and she was like, we had just moved to a new town, and she was playing with her kids at the playground. And I was like, I don't know how to do that very well. And so I just befriended her. And so maybe that's something too, where I just, and just had the weird conversation where I was like, you seem like a really cool mom and you're engaged with your kids, and like, I need friends. And, we ended up being, she hosted a book club. And so we ended up being really great friends. And, I think there's something that just kind of draws people in when people don't have to prove something all the time.
That's good too. You just raised another piece then. So like I was going to ask you about liturgies and how do we bring that into life? And I think you just gave a great illustration. I mean, having friends, right? I mean, a lot of adults don't have good friends, right? I mean, you've seen that, you just kind of shared that yourself. And so you find people that are fun to be with. And that can be a way towards playfulness. What else about like, say, liturgies? I mean, I know you quoted at least once, maybe it was a couple times, James K.A. Smith. And he talks about, you are what you love and all. And then I think you had some quotes from his book on Augustine also. So what are some of your go-to liturgies or practices? I mean, I guess you've mentioned daily office and some, so are there other like, maybe not so spiritual liturgies that you find help you to embrace limits and grow in grace?
Yeah. I mean, well, I've started just like even making lists, like in just like a composition book about like, where are my limits?
Yeah, that's good. It's a great
and
question.
just even just like naming them and writing them down feels like it brings a sense of freedom. We were at, I took my kids back to California for a week, and I was fretting the whole time because I was trying to get all this work done and I wasn't able to. I was solo parenting, the grandparents were there, but, I'm still responsible for my children. And, I just realized, okay, like I can't do it all, and worrying about it isn't making me actually do the work. So what am I going to do with it? And so part of it was, one, writing down my limits, and two, like just writing down everything I needed to do. So it just got out of my head. Like a brain dump as a spiritual practice can be really helpful too, so that we have space for people and for God and ourselves, and instead of turning everything around and around in our heads. So yeah, a brain dump as a spiritual practice can also be helpful with your limit list.
And would you do something like that again? That sounds like it could be a journaling practice. I guess you can just do it mentally. So is that like, do you recommend people do that like in the morning and the afternoon, or just any time for something like that? That's a great idea.
Yeah, I think, whenever you find yourself continually turning things over, just get out a piece of paper, dump it there. You can also use it as a form of prayer, right? As here, God, and bring you see all of these things that are swirling in my brain. Would you bring peace to my brain and help me know that who you say I am is as important as if I do or do not check everything off this list.
See, I think that's a great way to frame journaling too. Obviously, like prayer of excellence has always been thought of as a prayer, but but just what you just said, I mean, who would think that writing my limits down is a prayer? But it really is. And so I think I love how the way you just did there. I think it's wonderful. Now, if we live in a weird time now, right? And so we've had this COVID stuff. It's been super hard on parents that have children with figuring out how to do school. If you have a child that has special needs, even more scary. Like one of my grandkids has cystic fibrosis, so that's put a lot of pressure on the mom, my stepdaughter, and and all of us. We've just had to be super extra careful and stuff. So so it makes it hard to work for some folks. And then we have long term, our economy's had issues with people sometimes being underemployed too. So when we're talking about the desire to do it all, some people would probably like to have the shot to go for it, but they don't have it. So what's a spacious life look like for a person that doesn't know the time crunch because of life, the way the circumstances have gone for them?
I think no matter our employment kind of history, our limits, if we let them, can invite us to know God and to make him known and for him to know us. So I do think that transcends, right, how busy we are. I think often the limits look scary to someone who is busy and achieving so many things. And limits can look scary to those who are underemployed because it feels like, gosh, I'm never going to quote unquote make something of myself, or, I'm stuck in this retail job when I'm overqualified, but there's no other jobs. And so I think when we let our limits to of seasons particularly be a gift, we can press into them instead of fighting against them. I have a quiz on my website at A Spacious Life where I ask people what's their hustle habit. And, regardless of our employment history, I think we can ignore our limits, or we can try to control our limits, or we can blame other people and circumstances, or we can fall into like a shame spiral. And I think we can do those, if, let's say, you have a master's degree in master's of fine arts or something, and you've written a fabulous novel, but no one's picked it up. And so you're working at Starbucks 20 hours a week, and kind of cobbling together odd jobs. I think we can say, oh, well, here's the limits of this season, but and we can tend to ignore them, or that person could choose to like blame all of these systems. They could blame their loans. We could blame everything and say the problem is out there, or you could choose to ignore that kind of limit of that season and just throw yourself into work or throw yourself into a relationship. And none of those then are actually enabling us to both maybe accept a limit that we have in this moment, or actually bring that to God and to feel like we are known by him, and he understands that, and he will help us walk through that limit. I think most of the times we tend to choose one of those 4 ways of pushing off a limit. And so I would just encourage that person to press into that limit, to walk through maybe that loss and that pain, and know that we have our Savior who did the same thing.
That's good. That's good. And so, what's next for you, Ashley? Do you have again, I know, well, I guess what's next is you're working on getting your book out into the world here, but
yes.
do you already have something else in the works long-term? Do you have like a research project that you're continuing to build? I mean, you had your first book on finding holy in the suburbs. Now you have Spacious Life. Do you have some longer term goals over the next 5 or 10 years about what might be next for you?
Yeah. It is funny, right? How COVID is helping us kind of reevaluate so many things. People have moved, they've changed jobs and careers. And, I think both, there's a sense that I really love to keep writing. And I would love to turn kind of some of my PhD work into a book for the general public, that's read beyond like the 3 academics, who did my dissertation examination. So I would like to work with some of that material again. That sounds really fun. And then, as my husband and I, as we've talked about lots of kind of what are the cultural things in the water? Where can we best serve the church? I think besides kind of local pastoral ministry that he does, and ministry that we do together in our neighborhood and community, I think we're trying to address some of those larger questions about the ways in which these narratives of unconstrained freedom have actually caused a lot of pain and hurt for people, and what might be some ways in which we could reassert a good sort of institutionalism and communal identity for the church. So we're working on what that might look like, to bring together some good questions and practitioners and academics and writers and thinkers. So hopefully that becomes a thing
in the next, good.
In the next few years. But that's what we got going on.
This is kind of a strange question, but I like to ask it to see what people say. Is there a book that you're afraid to write that's inside of you somewhere, or you've at least thought about it, but you'd never even put a sentence to paper for it?
Yes, I love that question. I think it's a good question. I think every book is a book I'm a little bit afraid to write, like, oh, what's going to happen with this one? And just realizing that there will be a lot of loss and work and internal work that's required. And so, like everyone else, I want to fight against that. I have never really written fiction, and I would like to try that. And I think sometimes I can I already know it's going to be horrible, but it would be really fun to try. So that's something I would like to make time. Even right when we were talking about play, choosing okay, like I'm going to give myself 10 minutes, right? To play the guitar poorly or to write a really bad novel. And just those 10 minutes is a form of play. And so I think sometimes that might be a way to go forward.
That's good. That's really good. So, for you, in your typical day, when you talk about having limits and such, what does your day look like in terms of like your own personal, and you don't have to be any more personal than you want to on this question, but like, what's a rule of life look like for you right now with having small children and just being busy like you are? How does what does your rule of life look like?
Yeah, I think we have, in all of our ministerial contexts, we have led people through Pete Scazzero's Emotionally Healthy Spirituality course.
That's
And
good
so
stuff. Yeah.
it is. So that has been helpful, both like the communal aspect, but then it helps you practice the daily office and Sabbath and then be talking about all of these things in community, and then developing kind of a rule of life. I feel like our last year and a half have been full of a ton of transition. We ended up homeschooling our kids last year
Wow.
because 4 kids and COVID and work changes. And so I am hopeful once fall starts to feel like, okay, I can kind of re-enter that conversation about what does a rule of life look like when we have a little bit more, we have good limits, right? My kids will be in school and they'll have a few sports things that they're doing. And so it'll allow me, I think, this space in which to know, okay, what are the things, that bring delight? What can I do? Hiking, being out in nature, practicing the daily office and Sabbath. One thing we always do for our Sabbath is we make sure we have dessert that day, right?
Oh, that's
And
good.
and we have dessert first. So I think my youngest daughter thinks that that's what Sabbath is dessert, but that's okay. At least there's a positive connotation at this point. And so I think, those sorts of things will continue, but I'm excited to kind of see as there is some sort of normalcy, I hope, this fall, to see what kind of formational practices. But it's the daily office, it's the weekly Sabbath, it's like a monthly call with my spiritual director, and then I've actually started doing. I've put together some like pocket practices that I call practices you can keep in your pocket. And what I envision, so I've been starting to do some of those, and I put them together kind of as a pre-order for my book. But they're just little cards
Yeah.
that people could keep. I just imagine like the woman who's in the carpool and maybe despairing about her life. You got your pocket practices to read a bit of scripture or a truth to remember or a question to invite some reflection, and that these might be just small spiritual disciplines that we can take out in the middle of our day, or alongside our Bible reading in the morning, that might help us actually connect the dots between what we actually believe and how we live.
That's good. I love the thing with the Sabbath with I think you said it was your daughter about
Yeah.
associate Sabbath with dessert.
Yeah.
I mean, what a great memory that's going to be long term for her. And how
Right.
you're teaching the faith. Because I just remind me when my kids are grown up now, but when my 23-year-old was, I think 3 or 4, she associated going to church with being with her friends. And I love that. So I just remind me of that. So
Yes.
thanks for that. We can learn a lot
Yes.
from kids about
We
everything you've
can.
been talking about. So that's really cool. So
Yeah.
what would be what are 2 or 3 books outside of the Bible that have really helped you and you're thinking about spiritual formation, or really help shape you spiritually yourself?
I think one book that I kept coming back to when I wrote my first book was The Return of the Prodigal Son by Henry Nouwen, because that story about who God is was so formative for me to just kind of meditate on. I think we can say that God is good, but I think I had experienced moving back home to the suburbs. Like I knew that's what he had for us, but this was not my life plan. And so kind of meditating on that book was a way to begin to realize not just that, we're the younger son, but, but we're also the older son standing there in condemnation. And our God is like that father that comes and meets both sons in both like their righteousness and in their brokenness. And so I think it gave me a lot of freedom to figure out, how do I live this season well, to kind of remember and reimagine the goodness of God when sometimes we tell ourselves wrong stories about who God is. And more recently, I've just read Stephen Garber's Visions of Vocation. And one thing he talks about in that book is how what we know leads to responsibility, and responsibility leads to care. And I think it's just a helpful way to think about vocation and calling, in kind of very practical ways, that knowledge leads to responsibility. Because most of the time we're just like, oh, I just know this thing. But if we know it, then we're responsible for it, and not only responsible, but then we're invited to care. And I feel like that feels like a hopeful message.
And then the last thing, Ashley, where can folks find out more? I mean, you mentioned, I think it was spacious.life, where you can get a quiz. I mean, where would be, if folks want to connect with you online? I'll have your other links. I can put them in. I'll put them in the show notes. But where would be the best place for folks to find out more about you?
The very best place would be, it's A Spacious.life. So it's the title of the book. And you can, right there, you can do a little hustle habit quiz. And then I've provided like a one-page roadmap per type. So if you tend to ignore, blame, shame, or control your limits, I have like some few questions to consider and a Bible verse and a few practical pointers. So that's a great starting point. And then also on August 16th and beginning August 9th, I'm going to be opening up a new community called A Spacious Community to help not only think about the themes in the book, but you'll get some virtual meetings with me and coaching, and you'll get those pocket practices early on, which is pretty fun. So it'll be a way to like practice what does a spacious life look like before the book comes out. So that's all at aspacious.life. And then otherwise you can find me at social media at AA Hales.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Ashley, for being my guest today. I'm really grateful.
You're so welcome, Brian.
And grateful for what God's doing in your life, and the ministry of writing, and you sharing this wonderful book with the world.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here.
And thanks for all you listeners who are with us all the way to the end today. Until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be a voice of hope to others. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I invite you to check out the show notes for resources to find out more about this week's guest. And if you really found this episode helpful, would you take a couple minutes and share it with a friend, or share it on your social media? Or even better, if you could leave a review wherever you have located this podcast, and that will help other people to find it. If you're interested in centering prayer, I'd invite you to go to centeringprayerbook.com and sign up for information about my forthcoming book, Centering Prayer, Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life. It'll be out in September, and I'd love to share with you some resources to help you get started on a centering prayer practice in advance of my book coming out. We'll see you next week.